July 31, 1917. Belgian Flanders. 3:50 in the morning, darkness still hanging heavy over the Ypres salient. Then the earth erupts. 3,000 British artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along a front stretching miles across the low-lying fields of western Belgium. 4.5 million shells pour from the guns, tearing apart German positions, pulverizing trenches, obliterating everything in their path. This is the opening bombardment of the Third Battle of Ypres, an offensive that British Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig believes will finally break the deadlock on the Western Front, sweep the Germans from the Belgian coast, and perhaps end the war itself. What follows instead is 103 days of hell, a battle where men do not simply fear death by bullet or shell, but death by drowning in liquid mud, where stretcher-bearers take 6 hours to move a wounded soldier 200 yards through waist-deep slime, where soldiers disappear entirely, swallowed by the earth, never to be found, where the very landscape becomes the enemy, as deadly as any German machine gun. By the time the guns finally fall silent in November, the name Passchendaele will have become synonymous with the absolute worst that the Great War could offer. The mud, the blood, the senseless waste of human life in pursuit of objectives that prove meaningless even as they are achieved. By the spring of 1917, the Great War had devolved into a crisis of Allied morale and military effectiveness. In April, France launched the Nivelle Offensive, a massive assault that promised breakthrough and victory but delivered only slaughter. Within weeks, over 120,000 French soldiers lay dead or wounded for gains measured in yards. The catastrophic failure triggered widespread mutinies throughout the French army. Entire divisions refused orders to attack. Soldiers bleated like sheep being led to slaughter as they marched toward the front. French commanders resorted to mass arrests and executions, shooting soldiers pour encourager less orders. The burden of maintaining pressure on Germany now fell almost entirely on British shoulders. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, had long favored an offensive in Flanders, the low-lying region of western Belgium, where the British held a precarious salient around the ancient city of Ypres. This ground had been contested since 1914, when German forces captured the ridges surrounding Ypres, giving them commanding positions overlooking the British lines. From these heights, German observers could direct artillery fire on any movement below, making the salient one of the most dangerous positions on the entire Western Front. Haig's strategic vision for 1917 centered on a massive push from the Ypres salient. The objectives were ambitious, perhaps unrealistic. British forces would capture the ridges east of Ypres, advance to the Belgian coast, and seize the German submarine bases at Ostend and Zeebrugge. German U-boats operating from these ports were strangling British supply lines, sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. Haig believed that capturing these bases was essential to British survival. More fundamentally, Haig convinced himself that the German army was near collapse, that one more major offensive would shatter enemy resistance entirely. The Ypres salient occupied some of the most challenging terrain on the Western Front. The region sat in a shallow basin, barely 66 feet above sea level, surrounded by low ridges that provided natural defensive positions. For centuries, the land had been reclaimed from swampland through elaborate drainage systems, networks of ditches and canals that channeled water away from fields. But 3 years of warfare had destroyed this infrastructure. Shell craters pocked every square yard of ground. The water table, naturally high in this region, sat just 35 centimeters below the surface, even in dry conditions. Compounding these geographical challenges was Russia's deteriorating situation. In March 1917, revolution had toppled the Tsar. The new provisional government continued fighting, but Russian military effectiveness collapsed amid political chaos. By summer, it became clear that Russia might exit the war entirely, freeing massive German forces for redeployment to the Western Front. If Britain was to exploit the current balance of forces, it had to act immediately, before Germany could transfer divisions from east to west. The Ypres offensive began with a spectacular preliminary operation. On June 7, 1917, British forces under General Herbert Plumer launched an attack on Messines Ridge, a German-held position south of Ypres. What made this assault unprecedented was its opening act. At 3:10 in the morning, British engineers detonated 19 enormous mines that had been secretly dug beneath German positions. Tunneling companies had spent 2 years excavating galleries up to 100 feet deep and over a mile long, packing them with nearly 1 million pounds of explosives. The simultaneous detonation created what was arguably the largest human-made explosion before the atomic age. The blast killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers instantly, vaporizing entire companies in mushroom clouds of earth and fire. The sound was heard in London, 140 miles away, where the Prime Minister supposedly felt the rumble. Witnesses described pillars of fire shooting into the sky, creating craters 260 feet across and 60 feet deep. One German survivor later said the explosion felt like the earth itself had split open beneath his feet. Following the mines, 80,000 Allied troops advanced behind a creeping barrage that systematically devastated German defenses. Within hours, British forces captured the entire Messines Ridge with relatively light casualties. The success intoxicated Haig with confidence. If Messines could be taken so decisively, surely the main offensive at Ypres would succeed even more spectacularly. What Haig failed to appreciate was that Messines succeeded precisely because it was a limited operation with clearly defined objectives, meticulously planned over months, targeting a specific geographical feature. The main offensive would be different. Haig assigned command to General Hubert Gough, known for his aggressive approach and ambitious objectives. Gough planned deep penetrations into German lines, breakthrough operations that would exploit success and advance toward the coast. Herbert Plumer, the methodical commander who had executed Messines so successfully, advocated for his more cautious bite-and-hold tactics, advancing in short bounds with overwhelming artillery support. Haig chose Gough's aggressive plan, a decision that would prove catastrophic. On July 31, 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres began. After 2 weeks of preliminary bombardment, 9 British divisions, supported by French forces on the left flank, advanced from their jumping-off positions. The opening hours brought encouraging results. On the left wing, British troops captured Pilcombe Ridge and the village of St. Julian, achieving their objectives with lower-than-expected casualties. The attack seemed to be succeeding. Then the weather intervened. On the very first day of the offensive, rain began falling, and it did not stop. August 1917 became one of the wettest months Belgium had experienced in decades, with 127 millimeters of rainfall, double the normal average. The preliminary bombardment had destroyed what remained of the region's drainage systems. Millions of shells had torn apart ditches and canals, creating a landscape of overlapping craters. When the rain came, the water had nowhere to go. The battlefield transformed into a swamp. What happened next defied description, though many who survived attempted to put words to the horror. The mud at Passchendaele was not ordinary mud. It was a thick, viscous substance with the consistency of porridge mixed with glue, capable of sucking a man under within minutes. Shell craters filled with water became death traps. A wounded soldier falling into one face drowning, unable to climb the slippery sides. The mud clung to everything, adding impossible weight to equipment and uniforms, making movement exhausting beyond endurance. Stretcher-bearer William Collins later described the nightmare of evacuating wounded through this terrain. All you had was a couple of duckboards side by side, he recalled, and either side was about 10 feet of mud with the top of a tank sticking out of it here and there. If you fell off, it would take a traction engine to pull you out. It was absolute sucking mud. Collins witnessed men slip from the narrow wooden walkways and sink, their comrades struggling desperately to pull them free before the mud consumed them entirely. The newly introduced tanks, which had shown promise in earlier battles, became useless at Passchendaele. These armored vehicles, already mechanically unreliable, simply could not function in the liquid landscape. Tank after tank became hopelessly bogged down, crews forced to abandon their vehicles which slowly disappeared into the mud. Photographs from the battle show tanks tilted at impossible angles, half submerged, surrounded by shell-cratered desolation stretching to the horizon. Moving artillery forward became virtually impossible. Each gun required hours of exhausting labor to advance mere yards. Horses and mules hauling ammunition wagons struggled through the mire, often collapsing from exhaustion. Some animals drowned in shell holes. Others broke legs in the treacherous footing and had to be destroyed. Supply of even basic necessities became a monumental challenge. Rations arrived sporadically. Clean water was impossible to obtain. Medical supplies ran short. The entire logistics system strained near the breaking point. For the infantry, conditions transcended mere physical hardship. There were no proper trenches anymore. The mud made digging impossible. Men huddled in shell holes that offered minimal protection from artillery and none from the elements. When German shells landed, they threw up fountains of liquid mud that rained down on everyone nearby. Soldiers lived constantly soaked, their uniforms caked with filth, unable to get dry or clean. Trench foot became epidemic. Many men lost toes or entire feet to frostbite and infection. The psychological toll was immense. Men watched comrades disappear into the mud, sometimes within arm's reach, but impossible to save. The screams of wounded soldiers drowning in shell holes haunted survivors for decades. One officer wrote that troops no longer thought of the Germans as their primary enemy. The mud itself had become the foe, more dangerous than any human opponent. The landscape seemed actively malevolent, designed by some cosmic horror to torment and destroy. German forces faced similar conditions, but enjoyed one crucial advantage: concrete pillboxes. The Germans had constructed hundreds of reinforced concrete bunkers throughout their defensive positions, structures that provided shelter from both shells and weather. These pillboxes, with walls several feet thick, could withstand direct hits from all but the largest caliber shells. German machine gunners operating from these positions could fire on attacking British forces with relative safety, then retreat into the protective concrete when British artillery responded. Attacking these pillboxes required immense courage and usually resulted in heavy casualties. British soldiers had to approach across open ground, often through waist-deep mud, while German machine guns fired continuously. The standard infantry tactics of fire and movement became nearly impossible when movement itself was so exhausting. Soldiers carrying Lewis guns or heavy equipment simply could not advance. One battalion commander later wrote that he sent a written protest to brigade headquarters, warning that his men could not possibly succeed in such conditions. He was severely reprimanded for his pessimism. His men got no more than 50 yards before becoming hopelessly stuck in the mud. Yet the offensive continued. After the initial attacks bogged down in early August, Haig temporarily suspended major operations but refused to call off the campaign entirely. He replaced Gough with Plumer in command of the main effort, and Plumer implemented his methodical bite-and-hold tactics. In late September, as weather conditions temporarily improved, Australian and New Zealand forces executed a series of limited objective attacks that achieved modest success. On September 20, the Battle of Messines Ridge saw Australian divisions advance behind overwhelming artillery support, capturing their objectives and repelling German counterattacks. 6 days later, the Battle of Polygon Wood brought similar results. On October 4, the Battle of Broodseinde achieved what many considered the most successful single day of the entire Ypres campaign. Australian and New Zealand troops advanced 1,500 yards, captured the Broodseinde Ridge, and inflicted severe casualties on German forces preparing their own offensive. For a brief moment, genuine breakthrough seemed possible. Then, on the afternoon of October 4, right after the Broodseinde success, the weather broke again. Heavy rain resumed, transforming the battlefield back into a quagmire. The October weather proved even worse than August. Between October 4 and 9, 30 millimeters of rain fell, turning the captured ground into an impassable morass. Artillery could not be moved forward to support further advances. Ammunition could not be brought up in sufficient quantities. The offensive, which had shown such promise just hours earlier, ground to a halt in the mud. Despite the obvious impossibility of continued operations, Haig ordered the offensive to continue. The objective was now the village of Passchendaele, sitting atop a low ridge about 5 miles from the Ypres starting positions. Capturing Passchendaele would give British forces the high ground, supposedly providing better positions for the coming winter. In reality, the ridge was barely noticeable, rising only 60 meters above the surrounding terrain. But it had become a fixation for Haig, a symbol of victory that must be achieved regardless of cost. On October 12, British, Australian and New Zealand forces launched the First Battle of Passchendaele. The attack was ill-prepared and launched in pouring rain. Troops had to wade through mud up to their knees simply to reach their starting positions. When the artillery barrage began, it was barely noticeable, far weaker than previous bombardments, because so few guns had been successfully moved forward. Worse, when some guns fired, the recoil on the soft ground shifted their positions, causing subsequent shells to fall short onto their own troops. The New Zealand division suffered 1,000 casualties in just 2 hours, losing 85% strength in some companies. None of their objectives were reached. The attack was a complete failure, what New Zealand military historian Glyn Harper later called a massacre that should never have been launched. Junior officers had warned of the terrible conditions beforehand, but senior commanders ignored these warnings, insisting that the attack proceed on schedule. At this point, with the offensive clearly failing and casualty lists mounting horrifically, Haig made perhaps his most questioned decision of the entire war. Rather than suspending operations until conditions improved or abandoning the offensive entirely, he ordered the Canadian Corps to take over the assault and capture Passchendaele village. The Canadians, who had won glory at Messines Ridge earlier that year, were considered the British Army's premier assault force, its most reliable and effective formation. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie, commanding the Canadian Corps, inspected the battlefield and was appalled. He recognized immediately that the attack was nearly impossible under existing conditions. Currie even predicted with alarming accuracy that the operation would cost 16,000 Canadian casualties. He lodged formal protest with Haig, arguing that the objective was not worth such losses. But Currie ultimately felt unable to refuse a direct order from his commander-in-chief. Instead, he insisted on 2 weeks to prepare properly, time to build roads and tramlines, improve artillery positions, and give his troops adequate reconnaissance. The Second Battle of Passchendaele began on October 26, 1917, with the 3rd and 4th Canadian Divisions leading the assault. Conditions were nightmarish. Men waded through waist-deep mud, often unable to lift their feet, reduced to sliding forward through the slime. The 4th Division eventually had to retreat to within 100 yards of its starting point after suffering devastating casualties. The attack was renewed on October 30 with similar results. The 78th Canadian Brigade lost half its strength in a single day. Yet Canadian patrols did reach the outskirts of Passchendaele village, discovering that the Germans were preparing to withdraw. On November 6, the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions launched the final major assault. The 27th City of Winnipeg Battalion had the honor of actually capturing what remained of Passchendaele village. After months of bombardment, the village no longer existed. Where houses and shops and a church had stood, only rubble and shell holes remained. Capturing this pile of ruins cost the Canadians exactly what Currie had predicted: 15,634 casualties in just 2 weeks of fighting. A final attack on November 10 cleared Germans from the eastern edge of Passchendaele Ridge. Then, mercifully, Haig finally called off the offensive. The Third Battle of Ypres was over. 9 Canadians earned the Victoria Cross for actions at Passchendaele, the highest award for military valor. Their courage was unquestionable, their achievement remarkable, but the strategic value of what they had captured was essentially nil. The casualty figures for the entire Third Battle of Ypres remain subjects of historical debate, varying depending on how one counts and which sources one trusts. British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 310,000 casualties, including around 70,000 killed. German casualties totaled approximately 260,000, with many more killed and wounded than official records admitted. The Ypres salient had been widened by several miles. The Passchendaele Ridge was in British hands, and none of it mattered. In April 1918, when Germany launched its Great Spring Offensive, British forces abandoned all the ground captured at such cost during the previous autumn. The Passchendaele Ridge was evacuated without a fight. The villages were given up. The trenches were left behind. everything that 15,000 Canadians, 38,000 Australians, and hundreds of thousands of British troops had died or been wounded to capture was simply abandoned in a few days. The entire campaign had been for nothing. The strategic justifications for the offensive collapsed under scrutiny. The German submarine bases on the Belgian coast were never threatened, remaining firmly in German hands. The breakthrough that Haig repeatedly insisted was imminent never materialized. The German army, far from collapsing, remained a formidable fighting force that would nearly win the war in 1918. The only measurable result was attrition, grinding down both armies in a mutual bloodletting that achieved nothing except to fill cemeteries. Haig himself remained unrepentant. In his official report, he claimed that the ultimate destruction of the enemy's field forces had been brought appreciably nearer. He argued that German casualties exceeded British losses, making the campaign a success by attrition standards. This was cold comfort to the widows and orphans, to the men who would spend the rest of their lives with missing limbs or shattered minds, to the soldiers who had endured conditions that should never have been asked of any human being. The controversy over Passchendaele began immediately and has never truly ended. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George later wrote that Passchendaele was one of the greatest disasters of the war, that no soldier of any intelligence now defends this senseless campaign. Critics pointed out that the offensive should have been called off in August when the weather made further progress impossible. Others noted that Haig's fixation on breakthrough blinded him to the reality that modern defensive positions simply could not be broken by the tactics and weapons available in 1917. Defenders of Haig argued that maintaining pressure on Germany was essential, particularly with France's army in crisis and Russia collapsing. They pointed out that the terrible weather could not have been predicted, that August 1917 was the wettest month Belgium had seen in over 30 years. They noted that German forces suffered severely as well, that the battle did wear down German reserves even if it did not break them entirely. Some historians have suggested that Passchendaele taught important tactical lessons that would be applied successfully in 1918. Yet none of these arguments can fully answer the fundamental question: was Passchendaele worth the cost? Was capturing a low ridge worth 15,000 Canadian lives, 38,000 Australian and New Zealand casualties, and hundreds of thousands of British killed and wounded? Was a few miles of mud-soaked ground worth becoming the symbol of everything futile and senseless about the Great War? Physical landscape of Passchendaele today bears little resemblance to the hellscape of 1917. The fields have been reclaimed, drained, and returned to agricultural use. Villages have been rebuilt, but beneath the surface, the war remains. Over 60% of those who died at Passchendaele have no known grave, a higher proportion than at any other major Western Front battle. They simply disappeared into the mud, never to be found. Their names are inscribed on memorials instead of headstones. Tyncott Cemetery, the largest Commonwealth cemetery in the world, spreads across what was once the Passchendaele battlefield. Nearly 12,000 graves lie there, along with a memorial wall bearing the names of 35,000 missing soldiers. Walking among the white headstones, reading the epitaphs chosen by grieving families, one confronts the individual human cost of what appears in history books as casualty statistics. Here lies a 19-year-old private from Manitoba. There, a 32-year-old lieutenant from London, leaving a wife and 3 children. Next to him, a New Zealand farmer whose body was never identified. The name Passchendaele entered the English language as a synonym for pointless slaughter, for military failure, for everything that was worst about the Great War. British poet Siegfried Sassoon, who fought in the battle, wrote, "I died in hell, they called it Passchendaele." That single line captured what volumes of official reports could not: the absolute horror of the experience, the sense that the mud-soaked fields of Flanders represented hell itself, made manifest on earth. For the men who survived Passchendaele, the memories never faded. Veterans spoke of waking decades later from nightmares of drowning in mud, of watching friends sink into shell holes while being unable to save them. They remembered the stench of death and decay that permeated everything, the sound of shells falling into water with dull splashes rather than sharp explosions, the sight of the battlefield after the rain finally stopped revealing thousands of bodies that had been hidden beneath the surface. The Third Battle of Ypres stands as perhaps the most controversial and most tragic campaign of the entire First World War. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that generals' ambitions and political necessities could drive men into conditions that transcended horror, that courage and sacrifice, however extraordinary, could not overcome impossible terrain and impossible objectives, that sometimes the only victory possible is the victory of survival, of simply enduring what cannot be changed. The mud of Passchendaele swallowed thousands of lives. It consumed the optimistic belief that one more offensive would end the war. It destroyed faith in the commanders who ordered men to attack in conditions that made success impossible. And it created a legacy that endures over a century later, a name that still carries the weight of mud and blood and futility. If you found this exploration of one of World War I's most infamous battles informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth military history content. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future episodes exploring the battles, people, and events that shaped our world. What other great war battles would you like us to examine? Let us know in the comments below.